now at the macroeconomic situation, of course, a key driver of so many issues within energy and energy markets. We're looking really beyond BRICs and asking the question, is the mortar crumbling? Is the wind falling out of the sails of emerging markets as the pendulum, as we say, swings back from emerging markets towards the developed markets? These are some of the questions we're going to be asking you, and also asking two economists who I'm delighted to welcome to the stage now. And indeed, I'm going to make my way to the stage as well to welcome them in person. First of all, Tim Fox. He's the chief economist at Emirates MBD here in Dubai. Tim, if you could join me on the stage, please. Thank you very much indeed. Please make Tim feel very, very welcome here. And joining Tim with me is Trevor McFarlane. Trevor McFarlane is a contributing editor at the Economist group for the region. He's also research director at Gulfstat. Trevor, you're very, very welcome. Thanks indeed. Good to have you with us, Tim. Thank you. Trevor, thank you indeed. Nice to see you. Now, why don't you, Tim, have a seat next to Trevor, and then you can share a microphone. We have a couple here, but there's no need to overload the system. There we go. Tim, that one's for you. So what we're going to do now, how this is going to work, we're going to spend the next half an hour or so looking at some of the key issues, macro issues, that ultimately drive the oil markets and the oil industry. And we're going to do that using questions, and questions that we hope you will contribute to. Zamir, my colleague, I think, can we get the first question, please, for what we're calling Session B? Most of you, I think, familiar faces, you were here this morning and figured out how these work. It's basically multiple choice questions. We're going to ask you 5 questions over the next half hour or so, spread apart by about 5 minutes, and then we're going to put those responses to our panelists here and knock about these ideas and see if we can come up with some interesting insights and solutions. So let's get straight into this thing. Can we have the first question, please, Zamir? Thanks very much indeed. To taper or not to taper? That is the question. And they didn't, did they, last week? We all expected it to turn off the taps, but no tapering, not just yet. But they will, okay? The Federal Reserve is going to stop printing money sometime soon. If not last week, then the following week. Question is, how is the US Federal Reserve's eventual tapering of its monetary policy stimulus, how is that going to affect the global energy industry? You can see the questions up there. Pick up your little gadgets, okay, and press one answer that you think best corresponds to your feeling. The impact will reverse the 10-year upward trend of oil prices on weaker Asian demand. And no change, maybe. No change. Reduced energy demand in emerging markets, that's going to be balanced out or offset by growth in developed economies. Number 3, money will get more expensive, and that'll curtail production capacity expansion, squeeze energy prices, send them higher. 4, get back to normal. Normal trend lines of monetary policy make it easier to predict future supply and demand cycles. And 5th is interesting. 9 billion people, $200 a barrel. Here we come. Okay? Just take 30 seconds or so to discuss that among the table. What do you think about some of these issues? Have a conversation with the guy sitting next to you about whether you think which of these is most likely. And then we'll ask you to vote in just about 30 or 40 seconds' time. And then I'll come to you guys, and then we'll throw these around a little bit. We've got about 25 minutes or so, yeah. So, okay, pick up your little voting pads and cast your vote right now. Zamir, can we have the 10-second countdown, please? Thank you very much indeed. Voting is open. I can see all the responses pouring in now. Chaps, you don't get to vote, you get to speak. We want your qualitative rather than your quantitative. You can vote if you want to. I'm not going to stop you. Here we go. Well, a pretty even spread then. A pretty even spread. The number 1 response is no change. Reduced energy demand in emerging markets will be balanced out by growth in developed economies. And that was interesting because, Your Excellency, I remember your comment saying that in Europe, I think the word you used was saturation. Europe may grow again, but it's not going to be oil or energy-dependent growth. Tim, if I can turn to you first of all, what do you make of those responses?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency. My take is I'm not surprised, hugely, given the audience and its specialities in this sector, in the energy sector. I'm an economist, though, and so my response is probably going to be a little bit different, although it's not It's one of the mainstream ones, I suppose. I went for answer 4, which I think we should get back to normal in terms of monetary policy and get back to normal as soon as possible. Then businesses will have a much clearer field as far as making decisions are concerned. I think quantitative easing and issues about emergency monetary policy have kind of run too far, particularly in the United States. And I think the US made a mistake the other day by not withdrawing some of the stimulus that they've been sticking into the US economy. I think it was an optimal moment for them to have done so. The markets fully expected it. The economy was fulfilling a lot of the targets that had been set for it. So I think they'll never get a better chance and to execute a preliminary withdrawal of QE and have a relatively controlled reaction in financial markets. I think anything that goes on from here will potentially risk increasing volatility again. And you could even say that the delay to reducing QE and eventually removing it could actually have a counterproductive impact on the US economy if consumers and businesses start to feel the doubts in the Fed about the prospects for growth.
Trevor.
Good morning, everybody. I actually agree with Tim, but for the sake of lively debate and conversation and to enamor myself to the audience, I'm going to go with B and a little bit of 4, actually, or a little bit of 5, excuse me. So that's 2 and 5. Essentially, and I disagree with great respect to His Excellency, tapering is going to have an impact on all of us because we've seen this already since the announcement in May in emerging markets. Now, His Excellency mentioned that growth rates come from 10 to 7.5%. And that's fair enough when we're talking about China. But at the same time, if we look at what's happening in Latin America, in Brazil, the last quarterly growth rate is down to 2%. India is 4.4%. If these are the growth engines for the global economy, this is going to have an impact on all of us. We've seen from the announcement what's going to happen. But it's important that we have a discrimination between each country. And the countries that are going to be impacted are those with current account deficits. So the likes of India, the likes of Brazil, the likes of Indonesia. Now, at the same time, if we look at the secular, the long-term structural trends within the market, I would most certainly agree with His Excellency. If we look at the latest UN population projection figures, we see that population growth is happening in Africa and in Asia. India is going to be the world's largest population in around 2028, 2030, around this time. So we can see that the demand, just by virtue of the fact of population growth, is going to have an uptick. At the same time, I believe that, yes, I agree, the future demand markets will come from the east, due to that's where the growth will come from population. But at the same time, an uptick in OECD growth can certainly do no harm for prices on the short term.
And it was interesting picking up on the to taper or not to taper. I saw interesting comments by Jim O'Neill, former Goldman Sachs guy, the guy who coined the BRIC phrase. It was a CNN interview a couple of weeks ago, and he said, this is a phrase, the emerging markets should stop bitching and moaning about the Fed and get together and sort their own affairs out. And what he said was, if you had some kind of, informal currency union between China and India, things might be a bit better. And the example he gave was this, is if I'm a currency speculator and I'm thinking about shorting the Indian rupee, I'm going to think twice if I think that tomorrow morning the Central Bank of China is going to come in and buy rupees. He said that's what happens with the Central Bank of Japan, Switzerland, Europe, and the United States. They kind of get together, coordinated action. Why can't they do that in Beijing and New Delhi? Is that realistic, Trevor?
It's probably not so realistic in an actually happening with an informal union of some sort. But it's true with regards to the tapering, and particularly what the Fed. Bernanke is pretty much saying now, everybody expected this to happen last week. So it's not happening now. So really everyone assumes it's going to happen before the end of the year, but we don't actually know. And what Bernanke is saying is there's a lot of uncertainty. Get over it, basically. And it's interesting what the Indonesian central banker came out and said a few days ago. He said, look, this is great news that the tapering is not happening, but at the same time, it's up to us to knuckle down and do our homework, get our current account deficit under control, and tackle inflation. So it's up to these economies themselves. And China, when you look at the foundations of China, when it's not just from growth, we're talking about the surplus, the low debt. This is why people haven't been bailing out of China.
Let's get our next question. Zamir, can we get question number 2, please? Thanks very much indeed. Oil prices. Here we go. Pick up your little gadgets again, if you will. Not that long ago, they were $30-odd a barrel. 5 years or so ago, wasn't it? Before QE started. Here's the question. What will be the consequences for Gulf oil producers as OECD economies start to show a return to growth as emerging markets weaken? Okay? 4 options. Beware the beast of inflation sending Asian customers over a cliff. 2, end of QE means a stronger outlook for OECD growth, therefore higher oil price. 3, Gulf states win both ways. 3 billion customers on the eastern doorstep, the world's richest economies of the West on the western doorstep. Or 4, it's time to get back to business and forget all about this monetary policy noise. Vote now. Zamir, can we get the 10-second countdown, please? Thanks very much indeed. Pick up your voting devices, and gentlemen, I'm going to relax my rule about you not getting a vote and hand you back your gadgets.
Thank you.
4,
I always
3,
find it difficult to choose one.
2, 1. There you go. Gulf states win both ways. That's sort of clear answer. Not quite a majority, but it does stand out. What do you see, Tim? Is it a win-win situation for the Gulf?
Well, I think there is probably an outcome where the Gulf can benefit from growth in obviously the East and the West. My answer would have been probably, if I can have 2 answers, which my colleague here had, would be 2 and 4 probably. I think end of QE is probably a good signal for growth in terms of the OECD economies. It should signal confidence, it should signal investment plans, and it should ultimately signal consumption and a higher oil price. But I think, again, that QE and talking about it, we're getting bored with it in a way. It's better to get back to business. I think Mervyn King, former Bank of England governor, said that his ambition was to make monetary policy a boring subject. And I think he obviously failed in doing that. But I think it would be good if it went back into the closet again and businesses got on with the real task of making money.
Trevor?
Yeah, again, at the risk of being boring, I'd agree with Tim, but in reality, for Gulf producers, like all producers, it's going to come down to supply, demand, political risk, and also the speculation in the market. On the supply side, we'll probably see more supply. Things are quite tight now with what's happening in the US. Demand, we should see a bit of an uptick towards the end of next year or into next year. In reality, for the Gulf, we have to remember where the oil is actually going. 2/3 of it heads east into Asia and into the Pacific. At the same time, for Gulf producers, and really all producers, there's other issues at play that are, I think, a lot more interesting. Of course, there's the shale revolution, which is almost cliche and trite at this stage. But at the same time, it's what's happening to this natural gas. The liquefied or compressed gas is commonly finding itself into the tanks of light vehicles, trucks and lorries and so on. But what we're going to see is as it moves into ships, into power plants, into industrial and domestic heating systems in the US, that could shave demand off maybe a few million barrels a day by 2020. And at the same time, there's a very interesting piece of research, I'm not sure if you saw this, Tim, by Citi, and it says on the fuel efficiency side of cars, if fuel efficiency can improve on average by 2.6% a year, this in itself will help dampen demand. Now I know, essentially dampen global demand. A lot of people will sit here and say, yes, but if you look at the amount of the tens, the hundreds of millions of people itching to get behind a wheel in emerging markets, if you look at the fuel efficiency laws that are being put in place, particularly in China, they're even tougher than the West. So fuel efficiency is going to be a key thing. And the fact that 3/5 of oil ends up in the tank of some kind of vehicle, this is what the Gulf states should be not too concerned about, but certainly cognizant of the issue.
On occasions like this, I always quote Sean Evers of Gulf Intelligence saying if 2.5 billion people in India and China go from riding bicycles to riding motorbikes, we've got a significant demand spike for energy. So
and sorry, Richard, if you look at the highways being built in China, the highway system in the US would pale in comparison as well.
Let's get the next question, please. Thanks very much, Zamir. Can we get that? Thank you. China, there you go, le mot juste. China has sustained current account surplus, low foreign debt, huge exchange reserve, high savings, and capital controls. Happy days, while many emerging markets are buckling at the knees by contrast. Here's the question for you. How should one interpret the growing disconnect between emerging markets and China? 5 options. Don't short the China economic juggernaut now. 4th decade of high altitude growth. 2, China is the best at central command and protectionism, but buyer beware, as it all does mask the internal economic and social issues that need to be tackled. 3, China's growth pattern may be diverging from other emerging markets now, but that's just temporary. 4, China health is tied to the US and the EU, not Indonesia and India. And 4, all of the above and then some. So vote now. 10 seconds to go. Pick one of those 5 options that you think best tallies with your own views. Zamir, can we get the 10-second warning, please? Thank you very much indeed. It's not an exact science, just one of those responses that you think chimes a little bit with your gut feeling or your sense of the issues that we should be focused on. Thanks very much indeed. Well, a real spread there. Central command and protectionism, but it does mask some social issues. Number 4 as well, popular. China's health is tied to the US and Europe, not Indonesia and India. And then all of the above. Tim.
Well, I'm thankfully with the majority this time. Number 2. Generally, yes. I think all the answers again have something to be said for them. But essentially, China is very different to all the other emerging economies in Asia. It is the biggest. It has enormous population. It is a command economy. It is a planned economy where decision-taking and resource allocation is run by the state. And so that makes an enormous difference to the way in which that economy moves and develops. China's coming up to some pretty important, very important point later this year when its Politburo will be determining and deciding in November the 5-year plan for the economy going over the next 5 years. And you've got the conservative element within the Politburo arguing for steady as she goes approach, more investment in infrastructure, building out China, and the careful planning approach. Reformists there are arguing for breaking down some of the rules, allowing capital controls to be relaxed, and perhaps creating a more sort of fluid economy, which ultimately will carry the greater potential for stronger growth. But in the short term, if those policies are enacted, it may see softer growth to begin with, and then stronger growth further out. So there is going to be a big issue set to be determined, or a question set to be determined over coming months, particularly in November. At the moment, it seems that the Conservatives will probably have the upper hand, I think, in terms of that debate, given the way in which there is this attempt to rebalance growth and to control the slowdown and move away maybe from investment to consumption, but to manage that process so that China can protect its social infrastructure and maintain stability. I think that probably will be the one that wins out, which means that growth will remain probably in that 7 to 8% range, which we're becoming familiar with. Probably isn't going to go dramatically higher in the near term, but may not go much lower either. So a steady China probably. There is that disconnect between itself and the rest of Asia. It does trade very much with the developed world economies, as well as obviously having some impact with the rest of Asia.
9 million iPhones sold this weekend, all made in China, some of them sold in China. Trevor, as well as getting your thoughts on this survey question, is China now the only BRIC worth talking about?
Yeah, and in many ways, going to make myself unpopular with people from other BRIC countries, but in many ways, I think China was always the one with the financial muscle, and people would say, oh, it's easy to say that now. But in reality, if you look, I remember reading an article in Foreign Policy, and it's probably from 2011. And it says, if you look at the BRIC acronym that Jim O'Neill came up with in 2001, and then Goldman Sachs wrote this great paper in 2003. If you look at this acronym BRIC, and you take China, you take the C out, you're left with Brie. Brie is a soft, bland cheese. It's something that, once it comes under pressure, it softens very easily. And this is what's happening to the other BRIC countries. Whereas China, for the reasons listed in the question, it still has this financial muscle. And when you look at the BRIC initiatives, effectively China has the power of veto. Because if you look at its GDP output, it's actually larger than all the other countries combined. So without China, who really cares? This is the point. And this growing disconnect, I would argue this disconnect has always been there, as Tim alluded to. Now, with regards to everything is not rosy in China at the same time. And the key issue for me moving forward, and I think for everybody, is how the government manages to move away from this over-reliance on fixed asset investment, from building roads and bridges and factories and whatnot, towards more consumption-led growth, empowering consumers to go out and buy all this stuff that perhaps we don't really need, but we go and buy them anyway. And this is what will power the economy through. And another issue will be the fact that this fixed asset investment tends to come from state-owned enterprises, which themselves operate with implicit subsidies in many ways, and they operate in very sheltered markets. There's also worries about credit bubbles as well, and it's quite opaque in many ways within China. And the big, huge elephant, the obese elephant in the room, is when you have this type of wealth generation that's happening in China, and you've got a one-party state. You know, we haven't seen this wealth generation since the robber baron in the 19th century in the US. This is the type of wealth creation we're seeing. And when you have this, it puts great strain on the social fabric of a country. And also, particularly in light when we see these corruption scandals of late, you see Beaujolais in the news recently. This is the type of thing that can lead to social unrest. And when you have a one-party state, these things don't end very well. If we look at India, this is the great benefit of India. It's a large, thriving democracy in many ways. Well, it is. And while this is a very ugly and slow process at times in all countries, it's constantly nudging the country in the right direction, back and forth. So China has its challenges as well.
Let's stay in Asia. The next question, please, Zamir. Just a couple more to go before we break. Japan, Abenomics seems to be working. Are we on the verge of a golden decade for Japan? Interested to hear your thoughts on this. 5 responses. 1, Japan is back. 2, it's just hot air. Once the stimulus ends, it'll all be stagnation again. 3, stimulus or not, slowing emerging markets will be a drag on Japan's exports, and by extension, its export-driven economy. 4, only if the other developed economies pull upwards well. And 5, maybe it's just a bit early to say. Let us know your thoughts. Take 10 seconds and vote now. Zamir, can we get the countdown, please? What will happen when the sugar rush is gone, when the punch bowl is taken away from Abenomics? It's an interesting perspective. What do you think? There we go, pretty even spread. A lot of you say it's a little bit too early to say. If we discount that one, lots of concerns about hot air. Japan is back. Only 13% of people are jumping on that bandwagon. Tim, how about you?
Yeah, I think you've got
I've heard you on the radio talking quite nicely about Japan in recent months.
No, that's right, but it is a bit too early to say probably overall. Fortunately, I've not really focused on Japan in my career, 20-odd years in covering financial markets. I've not been a Japan analyst. That's probably a good position to be in to answer this question, because if I was a Japan analyst, I'd be depressed and probably very pessimistic about the future, because most initiatives have turned into growth initiatives have turned into nothing. You know, I would like to hope, and I'm an optimist, that Abenomics is going to work, but it has to get beyond the 3 arrows of policy which have been generated by Prime Minister Abe, and get beyond, as you mentioned, the sugar rush. If essentially what Japan is engaged in is a huge money printing operation. That money is going into a variety of areas, is ending up in a variety of areas, not necessarily all of it very good. It's ending up in the banks, sitting in banks and in cash. It's going to local authorities, which are not necessarily the best arbiters of where to put their money and how to invest it. Some of it's going to companies, and it's going to overseas companies. So part of the money that's going into Japan is going overseas. So you're probably going to get a weaker yen, which I think is a good news, and that's probably going to be beneficial for Japanese exports to a certain extent. That's one of the positives. But really, can it sustain growth beyond a currency effect? We still don't know, and the jury has to be out on that. I think we will have a weaker yen pretty much through 2014. Our forecasts are for it to go to 110, but I've seen other forecasts up to 140 for a dollar-yen rate. So there could be a very sharp adjustment in the yen still to be seen. The yen hasn't really been affected by the Fed decision last week in the same way that other currencies were. And I suspect that the yen is probably going to be the global funding currency going forward into next year.
140, and I'll be stopping off at Alpha Tay Motors to buy myself a new Lexus on the way home, but it hasn't happened yet. Foreman of the jury, is the jury still out, or has the jury reached its verdict yet?
Tim made all the interesting points there. I would just say, just perhaps to make everyone think a little bit, regards to tapering and Japan, if you look what's happening around the world, okay, rightly so, the first two arrows of Abenomics have, well, they've got the economy going. The structural side and the structural reforms is another issue. But if you look at the makeup of the Japanese economy, we're talking about a high-tech manufacturing export-led economy. If you look at its trading partners, China, 17%, number one. China's still in pretty good health. The US, we're starting to see, albeit torpid recovery by historical standards, we're starting to see a growth picture. Maybe if we can dodge the political grenades till next year, we could be looking at a growth rate of 2.5%. Europe is going to grow next year. So they're China or Japan's top trading partners, then South Korea. So from that point of view, its markets are going to grow. The yen, as Tim says, is in a good position for them, for exporters. Internally, there's massive structural reforms that need to happen. What they've basically focused on is industrial reforms up until this point. Many of them have been tried and failed in the past. They need to reform labor, they need to reform agriculture, they need to reform health services. And really, in the medium term, yes, the critics would say it's a print and spend policy, and that's true. But at least he's jolted the economy, and he's starting to have some inflationary pressures in the market. In the long term, you can't be so bullish on Japan simply because of the demography. Economic growth comes down to people, cash, and ideas, and their percentage of the working population, they're just getting too old. And therefore, the most important reform that he needs to make is on immigration. And this is a hot-button topic that, in an island nation like Japan with a strong sense of cultural identity, it's a very difficult policy to enact.
People, cash, and ideas. I'll add that to the list of pithy statements I steal from cleverer people than me and trot it out whenever appropriate. Listen, I can almost smell the coffee. One final quick question, and it's about inflation. Zamir, can we have the final question, please? Emerging markets inflation is an unwanted offspring of the unusual economics of QE. What's the medium-term impact to watch out for? 5 responses. They better get a grip on it. After all, this is how social unrest starts. Number 2, better brace for corporate results to be hit by sustained slow growth. 3, bond markets, watch them in emerging markets. 4, economic pressures are going to lead to structural reforms, which in turn will drive renewed economic growth. And so it'll be a nice outcome to expect for, maybe a bit optimistic. And finally, 5, jury's still out, too early to speculate about it. Let's quickly vote on this now. 10 seconds to go. Zamir, if we can pull up the 10-second countdown, please. Essentially, what's the big issue, the big thing we should be thinking about when it comes to inflation and prices? 3, 2, 1. Here we go. Overwhelmingly, but a clear winner there. They better get a grip on it. This is how social unrest starts, Tim.
Probably true. I think I'm not sure that inflation is the immediate byproduct of quantitative easing. I think there's part of it may be. I think the currency impact is quite a large one, and to the extent that the currency weakness in many emerging markets has been driven perhaps by partly as byproducts of QE, that may be a consideration which is bringing about some pressure on inflation, particularly as we've seen recently in India. I suspect as yields start to push up in the United States, as QE gets withdrawn, yields go higher, that will make life more difficult for emerging market economies and for their own bond markets. So I do see probably difficult times ahead for emerging market bond markets competing with US yields as they start to head higher. That would be my takeaway, and so I'm probably in the one of the lower camps there in terms of number 3.
Trevor, 30 seconds.
I think you could make points on all of them, but given one was the most popular, I'll run with that one. Inflation, of course, is something that's very important. We've seen Raghuram Rajan, the head of the Reserve Bank of India, he's gone very hawkish on this, and he's tackling inflation. Now, the picture of inflation globally, whether it's of what type of concern to run into unrest, if we look in Latin America, it's 7.5%. Japan is trying to stimulate inflation. The US, it's low. Europe, it's low. By historical standards in Africa, it's not in the double-digit figures. Here in MENA, it's very high due to what's happening in Iran. And also, if we look at Asia and Asia-Pacific, Asia, Australasia, that whole region, inflation there, we're looking at 4.5%, 5%. China, it's low. Actually, in India, we're talking about 10% on the consumer side, 6% on the wholesale side. So this is the type of inflation that gets politicians kicked out of office. And we've seen this in Jimmy Carter in the 70s, Labour in the UK in the 70s. Now, I'm pleased to say I wasn't even born in the 70s, so I'll have to hand over to my esteemed colleagues here to tell me what it was even like in the 70s. But this is the type of inflationary picture that puts pressure on politicians. It's not hyperinflation where prices increase by over 50% a month. That has dramatic impact on humanity. This is what the Nazis came to power on hyperinflation. The communists came to power on hyperinflation, both in Russia and in China. In Argentina, both military and civilian governments were toppled by hyperinflation. We're not at that point yet. And you could make points on pretty much all the issues there. They're all very interesting.
Well, gents, thank you very much indeed for those insights. It is now